Millionaire said, I don't shake hands with staff. Unaware, he was talking to the owner. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can stay close and never miss a new story. The elevator doors slid open with a soft whisper, revealing the gleaming marble lobby of Thompson and Associates Real Estate. The millionaire Brent Kingsley stepped out first, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor like a metronome of arrogance. His $3,000 suit hugged his frame perfectly, and his silver watch caught the light as he adjusted his cufflinks. Remember, he muttered to his assistant Micah, who was struggling to keep up while balancing a laptop bag and presentation folders. These people need to see success. They need to smell money. Micah nodded, his own modest suit wrinkled from the morning rush. At 28, he had the kind of quiet intelligence that most people overlooked, the same way they overlooked his contribution to every deal Brent closed. The presentation is loaded, sir. All the financial projections are. I don't need you to think, Micah. Brent cut him off, not even glancing back. I need you to carry things and take notes. That's what I pay you for. The words stung, but Micah had heard them before. He'd been working for Brent for 3 years, watching his boss take credit for strategies he'd developed, relationships he'd built, and insights he'd discovered through late-night research sessions. But the job paid well enough to support his sick mother's medical bills, so he swallowed his pride and followed. They approached the executive floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The conference room was at the end of a long hallway lined with awards and photos of successful projects. As they walked, Brent's phone buzzed. Kingsley. He barked into the device, not bothering to lower his voice in the professional space. No. I told you to handle the Peterson account. What do you mean you need my signature? Can't you see I'm busy closing a multi-million-dollar deal? He continued his loud conversation, oblivious to the disapproving glances from employees working in nearby offices. Micah wanted to disappear into the marble floor. As they neared the conference room, a woman appeared beside the heavy glass doors. She was 34, with rich brown skin that seemed to glow under the office lighting. Her natural curls were pulled back into a professional but effortless style, and she wore a simple black blazer over a white blouse, elegant in its simplicity. There was something striking about her presence, a quiet confidence that filled the space around her without demanding attention. She was holding the door handle, clearly intending to open it for them. Brent ended his phone call with an irritated grunt and noticed her standing there. For a split second, their eyes met. Hers were warm but observant, taking in details with the precision of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. His were cold, calculating, already dismissing her before he'd even formed a complete thought about who she might be. I don't shake hands with staff, he said, his voice dripping with disdain as he brushed past her without so much as a nod of acknowledgement. The woman, Jade Thompson, didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or look offended or demand an explanation. Instead, she simply nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and opened the door wider to let both men pass. What Brent didn't see was how the room fell silent as his words echoed off the glass walls. What he didn't notice was how Micah's face flushed with embarrassment, and he mouthed, "I'm sorry," to the woman as he hurried past. What he completely missed was how every person already seated at the long mahogany conference table looked up with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. But Jade Thompson saw all of it. She saw everything. Because Jade wasn't staff. She wasn't an assistant or a secretary or someone hired to open doors. She was the founder and majority owner of Thompson and Associates Real Estate, one of the most successful firms in the city. She was the woman who had built this company from nothing after being passed over for promotions at 3 different firms. Not because she lacked talent, but because she was a black woman in an industry that wasn't ready for her brilliance. She was the silent partner who preferred to observe potential business associates before revealing her identity. It was a strategy she'd learned the hard way, after years of watching people's attitudes change the moment they realized she held the power in the room. This approach revealed character, and Brent Kingsley had just revealed his. As she stepped into the conference room behind them, Jade caught the eye of Marcus Williams, her head of acquisitions, who was already seated at the table. His eyebrows were raised in a question that she answered with the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. 7 other people were seated around the table, her senior team, a few investors, and representatives from the city planning committee. They all knew who she was, and they'd all heard Brent's comment. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Jade moved with the grace of someone who had navigated far worse situations. She took her seat at the far end of the table, in what appeared to be the least important chair in the room. It was a calculated choice. From there, she could observe everyone without drawing attention to herself. She opened a simple notebook and pulled out a basic pen, looking for all the world like someone who was there to take minutes. Brent, meanwhile, was already launching into his introduction, completely oblivious to the minefield he'd just walked into. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "You're about to witness why Kingsley Development has become the most sought-after name in luxury real estate." He clicked a remote, and the large screen at the front of the room came to life with a flashy presentation full of gold lettering and dramatic swooshes. "We don't just build properties, we create lifestyles. We don't just develop land, we craft legacies." As he spoke, gesturing grandly at his slides, Micah quietly set up the backup materials, adjusted the projector when the image went slightly out of focus, and distributed copies of the financial projections to everyone at the table. It was clear he knew the presentation inside and out, every number, every timeline, every potential objection and response. But Brent took all the credit, never once acknowledging the young man who was making his show possible. "Our latest project, the Riverside Luxury Towers, generated over $50 million in pre-sales before we even broke ground," Brent continued, clicking to a slide that Micah had clearly designed based on the formatting and attention to detail. "That's the kind of results you get when you work with winners." Jade watched the performance with growing fascination. It wasn't just that Brent was arrogant. She'd dealt with arrogant men before. It was the way he seemed genuinely oblivious to the contributions of the person who was clearly doing half the work. Every time Micah quietly stepped in to fix a technical issue or hand out materials, Brent either ignored him completely or treated him like an extension of the furniture. 20 minutes into the presentation, Brent made his fatal mistake. "Now, I know what you're thinking," he said with a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Brent, this all sounds too good to be true. But let me tell you something. Success isn't about being nice. It's about being effective. It's about knowing who matters and who doesn't." He gestured vaguely toward Jade, who was still sitting quietly at the end of the table, taking notes. "I mean, I'm sure one of the admin girls could tell you that being polite doesn't pay the bills, right, sweetheart?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jade slowly looked up from her notebook, her pen still poised over the page. The small smile she'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by an expression that was impossible to read. Around the table, every other person had gone completely still, as if they were watching a car accident happen in slow motion and were powerless to stop it. Marcus Williams closed his eyes briefly, looking like a man watching his least favorite movie for the second time. Sarah Chun, the head of marketing, actually put her hand over her mouth. Even the city planning representatives looked uncomfortable, and they'd seen their share of inappropriate behavior over the years. But Brent, riding high on his own perceived brilliance, didn't notice any of it. He was already clicking to his next slide, something about projected returns and market dominance. That's when James Morrison, one of their longtime investors and a man who'd known Jade since she'd first started the company, decided he'd seen enough. "Actually, Brent," he said, his voice cutting through the presentation like a blade, "I think we'd like to hear Jade's thoughts on your proposal." Brent paused, his remote frozen halfway to the next click. He looked confused, as if someone had just asked him to solve a complex mathematical equation. "I'm sorry, what? Why would she?" "She owns the company," James said simply. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, slowly filling the room until they touched every corner, every surface, every person present. Brent's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, a sickly pale shade of panic. The remote slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. In the corner, Micah had stopped organizing papers and was staring at Jade with an expression of dawning understanding. All those times his boss had been dismissive, all those moments of casual disrespect, she'd seen it all. She'd been watching and measuring and judging, and Micah suddenly realized that everything that happened next would determine not just the outcome of this meeting, but possibly the trajectory of several lives. Jade slowly closed her notebook and stood up. Every eye in the room was on her now, and the quiet confidence that had been subtle before now filled the space with an almost gravitational pull. She was no longer trying to blend into the background. She was exactly where she belonged, in control of her domain. "It's amazing," she said, her voice calm and clear, "how people treat others when they think they're unimportant." And in that moment, everyone in the room knew that Brent Kingsley's world was about to change forever. The only question was, would anyone else's change with it? The conference room had never felt smaller to Brent Kingsley. As Jade's words settled over the assembled group like a heavy blanket, he could feel his carefully constructed image beginning to crack like ice under pressure. His mouth was dry, his palms were sweating, and for the first time in his professional life, he found himself truly speechless. I didn't," he stammered, his usual commanding voice reduced to a whisper. The man who had walked into this room 30 minutes ago like he owned the world now looked like a child caught stealing cookies. Jade remained standing, her posture straight but relaxed, like a queen who had never doubted her right to the throne. She didn't look angry. Anger would have been easier for Brent to understand and counter. Instead, she looked disappointed, and somehow that was infinitely worse. "You didn't know?" she finished for him, her tone neither harsh nor kind. "No, Mr. Kingsley, you didn't know? But that's not really the problem, is it?" She began walking slowly around the table, her footsteps soft against the carpet but somehow echoing in the silence. Every person she passed, her employees, the investors, the city representatives, watched her with the kind of respect that couldn't be bought or demanded. It had to be earned. "The problem," she continued, "isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is how you treat people when you think they can't help or hurt you. The problem is what that reveals about your character." Brent's hands were shaking now. He tried to hide it by clasping them behind his back, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. "Miss Thompson, it is Miss Thompson, right? I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply focused on." "On what?" Jade stopped walking and faced him directly. "On impressing the people you thought mattered while dismissing the ones you thought didn't? On taking credit for work you didn't do while treating the person who actually did it like furniture?" For the first time since the revelation, she looked toward Micah, who was still standing by the projector, holding a stack of papers and looking like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "Your assistant has been managing your presentation, fixing your technical difficulties, and clearly knows more about the financial projections than you do. But you've spoken to him, and about him, like he's invisible." Micah felt his heart pounding. In 3 years of working for Brent, no one had ever acknowledged his contributions so directly. He'd grown used to being the invisible engine that made Brent's machine run smoothly. But having someone see his value, especially someone as successful as Jade Thompson, was overwhelming. "Micah does good work," Brent said quickly, sensing an opportunity to recover. He's very dedicated." "Dedicated," Jade repeated, and there was something sharp in her voice now. "Is that what you call it when someone does the research for your presentations? When they handle your client communications? When they solve your problems while you take meetings about golf handicaps?" The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Marcus Williams, who had worked with Jade for 8 years, had never seen her like this. She was always composed, always in control, but there was something different happening here. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. Sarah Chun, the marketing head, found herself thinking about her own journey in the corporate world. How many times had she been dismissed or overlooked? How many meetings had she sat in where men like Brent had talked over her or around her as if she didn't exist? Watching Jade handle this situation with such grace and power was like watching a masterclass in professional dignity. "I built this company," Jade said, her voice growing stronger, "from nothing. 12 years ago, I was working at Prestige Properties, bringing in more clients than any other agent they had. But when promotion time came, they gave the position to a man with half my sales record and a quarter of my work ethic." She paused, letting that sink in. "So I left, started my own firm with $15,000 in savings and a dream that maybe, just maybe, there was room in this industry for someone who believed that success comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down." Brent tried again to salvage the situation. That's an inspiring story. Really. And I want you to know that Kingsley Development shares those values. We believe in." "Do you?" Jade's question cut through his rehearsed response like a sword. Because 20 minutes ago, you couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge my existence. You referred to me as one of the admin girls and made a joke about how being polite doesn't pay the bills. The words hit Brent like physical blows. Every arrogant comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty was coming back to haunt him. He could see his multi-million-dollar deal slipping away like sand through his fingers. But worse than losing the contract was the growing realization that everyone in this room, including his own assistant, was seeing him for exactly what he was. Not a successful businessman or a master negotiator, but a bully who had confused intimidation with leadership and arrogance with confidence. "I apologize," he said, finally extending his hand toward Jade. "I was out of line. Perhaps we could start over?" Jade looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Around the table, everyone held their breath. This was the moment that would define not just this meeting, but potentially the future of several careers. She didn't take his hand. "Mr. Kingsley," she said quietly, "I don't work with people who treat others as disposable. I don't do business with men who think respect is something you only show to people who can write you checks." The rejection was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for the full impact to register. When it did, Brent's face went from pale to gray. This wasn't just a lost deal. This was professional humiliation on a scale he'd never experienced. "But," Jade continued, turning away from Brent and toward his assistant, "that doesn't mean this meeting has to end in disappointment for everyone." Micah looked up from the papers he'd been clutching like a life preserver. "Ma'am, you've been quietly managing this entire presentation," Jade said. Her voice warmed now in a way it hadn't been when she was speaking to Brent. "You know the financial projections, you understand the market analysis, and from what I observed, you've been the one doing the actual work." I. Micah stammered, completely unprepared for this turn of events. "Tell me about the Riverside project," Jade said, settling back into her chair and opening her notebook again. "Not the sales pitch. I want to hear about the real challenges, the actual timelines, the honest assessment of risks and opportunities." For the first time in years, Micah felt like someone was actually asking for his professional opinion rather than his ability to carry bags and take notes. He glanced nervously at Brent, who was standing frozen by the projector, then back at Jade. "The Riverside project has strong fundamentals," he began hesitantly, then gained confidence as he saw Jade's encouraging nod. "The location is excellent, and we've secured favorable zoning arrangements. But there are some infrastructure challenges that will need to be addressed, and the timeline Mr. Kingsley presented might be optimistic." "How optimistic?" James Morrison asked, leaning forward with interest. Micah took a deep breath. This was his moment to tell the truth, not the sanitized version that Brent preferred, but the honest assessment that his research had uncovered. "The utility upgrades alone will probably add 6 months to the initial phase," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And the environmental impact study revealed some concerns about drainage that will require additional engineering consultations. We're looking at probably 18 months for full completion rather than the 12 months in the presentation." Brent's face was now a shade of red that suggested either rage or a medical emergency. "Micah, that's exactly what I wanted to hear," Jade interrupted, never taking her eyes off Micah. "Honest assessment, realistic timelines, acknowledgement of challenges. That's how real business gets done." She stood up again, and this time everyone could feel the shift in the room's energy. The disappointed observer was gone, replaced by the shrewd businesswoman who had built an empire from nothing. "Micah," she said, "I'd like to offer you a contract." The words hit the room like lightning. Brent's mouth fell open. The investors straightened in their chairs. Marcus Williams found himself smiling for the first time all morning. And Micah felt like the world had just tilted on its axis. "I'm sorry, what?" he managed to whisper. "Thompson and Associates is looking for a project development consultant," Jade explained, her tone businesslike but warm. "Someone who understands the real challenges of complex developments, who can provide honest timelines and risk assessments, and who has the integrity to tell clients what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear." She paused, letting the magnitude of her offer sink in. The contract would be for the Riverside project specifically, but with potential for expansion based on performance. "You'd be working directly with my team. using your knowledge of this project to help us determine whether it's worth our investment. Micah felt his knees go weak. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to step out of Brent's shadow and prove what he could do when his contributions were valued rather than hidden. But he looked at Brent, who was staring at him with an expression of absolute betrayal. 3 years of loyalty, of taking abuse, of watching his boss take credit for his work, and now this moment of terrible, wonderful justice. You don't owe him anything, Jade said quietly, reading his hesitation perfectly. Loyalty is earned, not demanded, and respect flows both ways. The room waited. Outside the windows, the city continued its busy day, unaware that in this conference room, several lives were about to change forever. Micah looked at the faces around the table. Jade's encouraging smile, Marcus Williams' approving nod, Sarah Chen's supportive expression. Then he looked at Brent, who had given him nothing but condescension and criticism for 3 years. I accept, he said, his voice clear and strong. And in that moment, Brent Kingsley realized that his arrogance had cost him more than just a business deal. It had cost him the one person who had been making his success possible all along. The silence that followed Micah's acceptance stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Brent Kingsley stood frozen by the projector, his face cycling through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope: disbelief, fury, panic, and something that might have been the first genuine self-reflection of his adult life. You can't be serious, he finally managed, his voice hoarse. Micah, you signed a non-compete agreement. You're under contract with Kingsley Development for another 8 months. Jade raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Actually, Mr. Kingsley, I had my legal team review your standard employment contracts this morning after your assistant sent over the preliminary documents. The room's attention sharpened. Marcus Williams leaned back in his chair, recognizing the look on his boss's face. She'd been planning this moment from the second Brent had brushed past her in the hallway. Your non-compete clause specifically prohibits employees from working with direct competitors in the luxury residential development space, Jade continued, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what was clearly a legal document. Thompson & Associates specializes in commercial real estate and mixed-use developments. We're not direct competitors. Brent's face went ashen. He'd used that same contract language to intimidate dozens of employees over the years, never imagining it would be turned against him by someone who actually understood legal nuances. Furthermore, Jade added, the contract requires that employees be given adequate resources, support, and recognition for their contributions to company success. I think we've established that hasn't been the case. She closed the tablet and looked directly at Brent. Any competent employment attorney would have that contract voided in a week, based solely on what we've witnessed in this room today. Micah felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone drowning, but the bright, expansive hope of someone who suddenly sees a path forward. For 3 years, he'd told himself that the job market was too competitive, that he was lucky to have steady work, that dealing with Brent's treatment was just the price of financial security. But watching Jade systematically dismantle his boss's intimidation tactics was like watching someone turn on lights in a room he'd thought was permanently dark. This is insane, Brent said, his voice rising. Micah, think about what you're doing. I gave you a chance when no one else would. I taught you the business. You owe me. He owes you nothing. Jade's voice cut through his protests like a blade. If anything, you owe him 3 years of proper recognition, appropriate compensation, and basic human respect. She stood and walked to where Micah was still standing by the presentation materials. Tell me, what percentage of the research and preparation for today's meeting did you handle? Micah glanced nervously at Brent, then back at Jade. Old habits died hard, and he'd spent years minimizing his contributions to avoid his boss's ire. But something about Jade's direct gaze and genuine interest made honesty feel not just possible, but necessary. About 90%, he said quietly. Speak up, Jade encouraged. Everyone should hear this. 90%, Micah repeated, his voice stronger. I did the market analysis, compiled the financial projections, designed the presentation slides, researched the zoning requirements, and prepared all the backup documentation. Around the table, eyebrows rose and knowing looks were exchanged. James Morrison had been in business for 40 years, And he'd seen this dynamic countless times. Talented people being exploited by mediocre managers who took credit for their work. And what percentage of the credit did you receive? Jade asked. Micah's laugh was bitter. 0. Mr. Kingsley doesn't. He doesn't typically acknowledge individual contributions. That's not true, Brent protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I've always. Micah knows I appreciate. When Jade's single word landed like a hammer. When have you publicly acknowledged his contributions? When have you recommended him for a promotion or a raise? When have you given him opportunities to present his own work or develop his own client relationships? The questions hung in the air unanswered because they were unanswerable. Everyone in the room, including Brent himself, knew the truth. Sarah Chun found herself thinking about her own early career, about bosses who had taken credit for her marketing campaigns while giving her none of the recognition. She'd fought her way up through sheer determination, but she remembered the feeling of invisibility, of being essential but unacknowledged. This is exactly why I started my own company, Jade said, her voice taking on a passionate intensity. I was tired of watching talented people get buried under the egos of insecure managers. I was tired of seeing good ideas attributed to whoever had the loudest voice in the room. She turned to address the entire table now, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. 12 years ago, I brought in the Peterson account, $43 million in sales over 2 years. My manager presented it as his achievement to the board and got a promotion based on my work. When I confronted him, he told me that team success was more important than individual recognition. The pain in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. These weren't just business principles she was discussing. They were scars that had shaped her entire approach to leadership. 6 months later, I quit and started Thompson & Associates with one client and a fierce determination to build something different. A place where talent gets recognized, where contributions matter, where people are valued for their abilities rather than their ability to play politics. Marcus Williams nodded, remembering those early days. He'd been Jade's third hire, leaving a comfortable position at an established firm because he believed in her vision of ethical leadership. Watching her now, seeing her turn that vision into action, filled him with pride. Mr. Kingsley, Jade continued, turning back to Brent, you represent everything I built this company to combat. You're the manager who steals credit, the boss who demands loyalty without earning it, the leader who confuses intimidation with inspiration. Brent tried one more desperate gambit. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The market is competitive. I have investors to satisfy, deadlines to meet. Sometimes you have to make tough choices. Tough choices, Jade repeated, her voice cold. Is that what you call treating people like they're disposable? Is that what you call taking credit for work you didn't do? She walked back to her seat, but remained standing, commanding the room with quiet authority. I've been under pressure since the day I started this company. I've missed payroll twice in the early years, working 18-hour days to keep us afloat. I've lost deals, made mistakes, faced competitors with 10 times my resources. Her voice grew stronger with each word. But never, not once, did I solve those problems by diminishing the people who worked for me. Because I learned something that you apparently never did. Sustainable success comes from building people up, not tearing them down. The room was electric with tension and possibility. City Planning Representative Jennifer Walsh found herself taking notes, not about the development project, but about leadership principles she wanted to remember. This was the kind of executive she wished she worked with more often. Someone who understood that business success and human dignity weren't mutually exclusive. Micah, Jade said, her tone shifting back to warmth. I want to be clear about what I'm offering you. This isn't charity or sympathy. This is recognition of demonstrated ability. She pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted a document. Thompson & Associates is prepared to offer you a 6-month consulting contract with a base fee of $75,000, plus performance bonuses based on project outcomes. You'll have your own office, administrative support, and direct access to our legal and technical resources. Micah felt his knees go weak again. $75,000 was more than he made in a year working for Brent, and this was just for 6 months. But more importantly, Jade continued, you'll have the opportunity to present your own work, develop your own client relationships, and build a reputation based on your actual contributions rather than someone else's credit-taking. She paused, letting the magnitude of the offer sink in. If the consulting arrangement works out, and I believe it will, we'll discuss bringing you on as a permanent member of our development team with equity participation and a clear path to partnership. Partnership. The word hit Micah like lightning. In 3 years with Brent, the best he'd ever been offered was a modest raise and the vague promise that his contributions were noted. Now this woman, this successful, respected businesswoman, was talking about making him a partner. "You're making a mistake," Brent said desperately, his voice cracking. "Mike is not ready for this kind of responsibility. He needs guidance, structure. He's not leadership material." The words were intended to undermine Micah's confidence, but they had the opposite effect. For the first time, Micah saw his boss's criticism for what it really was, not honest assessment, but manipulation designed to keep him small and dependent. "Mr. Kingsley," Jade said, her voice deadly calm, "in the last hour, your assistant has demonstrated more professionalism, integrity, and business acumen than you've shown in your entire presentation. If he's not leadership material, what does that make you?" The question landed like a physical blow. Brent stumbled backward slightly, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. And in that moment, Micah made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire life. "Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice clear and confident, "I accept your offer, and I give my notice to Kingsley Development, effective immediately." The declaration hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, reverberating through the room and through the lives of everyone present. Brent Kingsley, the man who had walked into this room an hour ago expecting to close the biggest deal of his career, now stood facing the collapse of everything he'd built his identity around. And Micah, who had walked in as an invisible assistant, was walking out as a consultant with his own contract and a future bright with possibility. But the real transformation belonged to Jade Thompson, who had once again proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply see people for who they really are and treat them accordingly. The 48 hours following the Thompson and Associates meeting marked the beginning of what Brent Kingsley would later think of as the great unraveling of his life. It started with small things, missed calls, unreturned emails, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how people responded to his name. Brent sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian building, staring at his phone as it buzzed with yet another notification. The Peterson account wanted to reassess their development strategy. The Morrison Group had decided to explore other options. 3 other potential clients had suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts that would delay their meetings indefinitely. News traveled fast in the real estate world, especially when it involved someone as prominent as Jade Thompson. The story of his humiliation at Thompson and Associates had spread through the industry like wildfire, growing and morphing with each retelling. By now, according to the version he'd heard from his secretary, he'd apparently insulted Jade directly, made racist comments, and been physically escorted from the building by security. None of that was exactly true, but the actual truth was somehow worse. He'd revealed his character so completely that no embellishment was necessary. His secretary, Maria, knocked on his door frame. She'd worked for him for 2 years, handling his schedule with quiet efficiency, and he'd never bothered to learn her last name or ask about her family. "Mr. Kingsley? The Riverside investors want to schedule a conference call for this afternoon. They're concerned about some of the timeline discrepancies that have come to light." Timeline discrepancies. That was corporate speak for, "We found out your assistant was the one who actually knew what he was talking about, and now we're wondering what else you've been wrong about." "Fine," Brent muttered, not looking up from his desk. "Set it up." Maria hesitated in the doorway. "Sir, I also need to let you know that I've accepted a position with another firm. I'll be giving my 2 weeks' notice today." That got his attention. Maria had never shown any signs of dissatisfaction, never complained about her workload, or asked for more money. She was exactly the kind of employee he'd always taken for granted: competent, reliable, and invisible. "Why?" he asked, though he was already beginning to suspect the answer. "Thompson and Associates offered me a position as executive assistant to their head of client relations," she said quietly. "It's a significant salary increase, and the work environment seems more collaborative." More collaborative. Another euphemism. This one meaning they treat their employees like human beings. After Maria left, Brent found himself alone in his office for the first time in years without Micah there to handle the constant stream of calls, emails, and urgent requests that made up his daily routine. He'd never realized how much his assistant had been managing until suddenly none of it was getting managed. His computer pinged with an email marked urgent from the Riverside Project investors. With growing dread, he opened it to find a detailed list of questions about construction timelines, permit requirements, and environmental impact assessments, all things that Micah had handled and that Brent had never bothered to fully understand. The questions were technical, specific, and required immediate answers. Brent stared at the screen, feeling a growing sense of panic as he realized he couldn't answer a single one of them without calling Micah, who was no longer his employee. His phone rang. The caller ID showed James Morrison, one of the investors who'd been in the Thompson and Associates meeting. Brent, Morrison's voice was crisp and businesslike. I've been hearing some interesting things about the Riverside project, specifically about who is actually managing the development details. Brent's mouth went dry. Jim, I can explain. Can you? Because I've got a stack of emails here from the last 6 months, all signed by you, but with a level of technical detail and market analysis that, frankly, I never thought you were capable of. Morrison paused, letting that sink in. I had my team do some digging. Turns out your assistant, excuse me, your former assistant, was the one corresponding with our engineers, our financial analysts, and our environmental consultants. He was the one who caught the drainage issues that could have cost us millions down the line. Brent closed his eyes, feeling the walls closing in around him. So here's my question, Brent. If Micah was doing all the actual work, what exactly were we paying you for? The line went dead before Brent could formulate an answer. Meanwhile, across town at Thompson and Associates, Micah was experiencing what could only be described as culture shock. His new office, an actual office with a door and a window, was larger than the cubicle he'd occupied at Kingsley Development. But more than the physical space, it was the atmosphere that left him speechless. The coffee machine is around the corner, Sarah Chun was saying as she gave him a tour of the office. We've got a full kitchen if you want to bring lunch, and there's a gym membership benefit if you're interested. She paused at a bulletin board covered with photos and certificates. These are some of our recent project completions. Everyone who contributes to a successful project gets their name on the completion certificate, regardless of their role in the company. Micah studied the certificates, seeing names he recognized from the meeting: Marcus Williams, Sarah herself, even administrative assistants and junior analysts. It was such a foreign concept that he had trouble processing it. Everyone gets recognized? He asked. Of course, Sarah said, looking at him with something that might have been pity. Why wouldn't they? Success is a team effort. Jade believes that if you contribute to a win, you should share in the recognition. As they continued the tour, Micah met his new colleagues, people who looked up from their work to actually greet him, who asked about his background and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. The contrast with his previous workplace was so stark it was almost disorienting. Micah, Jade appeared in the hallway, carrying a stack of files. Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to go over the Riverside project details with you. In her office, a space that managed to be both elegant and approachable, Jade spread out the project files and pulled up a chair beside her desk rather than sitting behind it. Another small gesture that spoke volumes about her leadership style. I want to be completely transparent with you about what we're dealing with, she said, opening the first file. The Riverside project has strong potential, but there are some significant challenges that need honest assessment. For the next hour, they went through every aspect of the development: the financial projections, the timeline concerns, the environmental issues, the permit requirements. But unlike his conversations with Brent, this wasn't a one-way information dump. Jade asked for his opinions, challenged his assumptions, and built on his ideas. Your analysis of the drainage issues was spot on, she said, pointing to a technical report. That's exactly the kind of thorough preparation that prevents disasters down the line. How did you identify that problem? Micah felt a flush of pride. I always visit the actual sites before making recommendations. The city records showed historical flooding in that area, but the soil composition tests revealed the real extent of the problem. You visit the sites personally? Jade looked impressed. That's more hands-on research than most developers do. Mr. Kingsley thought it was unnecessary, Micah said, then immediately wished he hadn't brought up his former boss. Jade's expression darkened slightly. Mr. Kingsley thought a lot of things were unnecessary. That's why his projects have a failure rate 3 times higher than the industry average. She pulled out another file. This is where things get interesting. Thompson and Associates has been considering the Riverside location for almost a year. We've done our own preliminary research, and your assessment matches ours almost perfectly. Micah's eyes widened as he looked at the comprehensive analysis, geological surveys, market studies, financial modeling that went far beyond anything he'd seen at Kingsley Development. The question, Jade continued, is whether we can make this project work better than Brent Kingsley ever could. And based on what I've seen of your work, I think we can. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those observant eyes that seemed to see everything. Micah, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. What would you do differently with the Riverside project if you had complete creative control? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked for his vision before. He'd always been expected to execute someone else's ideas. He started, then stopped and took a breath. If it were up to me, I'd scale back the luxury focus and create more mixed-income housing. The market research shows strong demand for quality, affordable units, and it would make the project more financially stable long-term. Jade nodded encouragingly. Go on. I'd also incorporate more green space and sustainable features. The environmental impact would be lower, and buyers are increasingly interested in eco-friendly developments. It might cost more upfront, but the long-term value would be higher. And the timeline? 18 months minimum, possibly 24 if we do it right. Brent's 12-month projection was never realistic. It was just what he thought investors wanted to hear. Jade smiled, the first genuinely warm smile Micah had seen from her. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Realistic timelines, sustainable design, market-responsive planning. That's how we build projects that last. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. Micah, I'm going to make you an offer that might sound crazy. Instead of just consulting on the Riverside project, I want you to lead it. Your vision, your timeline, your team. The words hit him like lightning. Lead it? But I don't have experience managing. You've been managing it for months, Jade interrupted. You just haven't been getting the credit. The difference is that now you'll have the authority to match your responsibility. She turned back to face him, and there was something in her expression that reminded him of the moment in the conference room when she'd first offered him the contract. A combination of confidence and compassion that made him believe things were possible that he'd never dared imagine. I won't lie to you, it's a big responsibility. You'll have a team of architects, engineers, and contractors reporting to you. You'll be the primary contact with investors and city planners. And if the project succeeds, you'll get the recognition you deserve. If it fails, you'll take the responsibility for that too. Micah felt his heart pounding. This was everything he dreamed of during those long nights of doing Brent's work while receiving none of the credit. But it was also terrifying. The weight of actual leadership, the possibility of visible failure. What if I'm not ready? He asked quietly. Jade's expression softened. Micah, I've been watching you work for the last 2 days. You've handled every challenge we've thrown at you with intelligence, integrity, and creativity. You know this project better than anyone, and you have the support of an entire team who believes in what we're building here. She paused, letting her words sink in. The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is whether you're brave enough to bet on yourself the way I'm betting on you. Outside Jade's office window, the city sprawled in all directions. Millions of people living and working in buildings that someone had once envisioned, planned, and brought to life. Projects that had started as ideas in someone's mind and ended as communities where families built their lives. Micah looked at the files spread across Jade's desk, representing months of work and millions of dollars in potential investment. Then he looked at Jade herself, this woman who had built an empire by seeing potential in people that others overlooked. I accept, he said, his voice steady and sure. And as those words left his mouth, Micah realized that the scared, invisible assistant who had walked into the Thompson and Associates conference room 3 days ago was gone forever. In his place stood someone ready to build something meaningful, not just buildings, but a career based on his own merit and vision. The transformation was complete. 6 months later, the Riverside project had become the talk of the real estate industry, but not for the reasons Brent Kingsley had originally envisioned. Under Micah's leadership, what had started as another generic luxury development had evolved into something unprecedented, a mixed-income community that was both profitable and transformative. Micah stood on the construction site at dawn, wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, watching as the framework of the first building took shape against the morning sky. The sight still filled him with wonder, not just that he was seeing his vision become reality, but that people trusted him enough to invest millions of dollars in his ideas. "Morning, boss," called out Elena Rodriguez, the project foreman. 6 months ago, Micah would have been shocked to hear anyone call him boss. Now, it felt natural, not because he demanded respect, but because he'd earned it. "How are we looking on the foundation work?" he asked, pulling out his tablet to review the day's schedule. "Ahead of schedule, actually," Elena said with pride. "The crew's been motivated since you implemented the completion bonuses. Funny how people work harder when they know their effort will be recognized." Micah smiled. The completion bonuses had been his idea, inspired by Jade's philosophy that everyone who contributed to success should share in it. Traditional construction projects paid workers hourly wages regardless of performance, but Micah had convinced the investors to set aside a percentage of profits for the entire construction team if they met quality and timeline benchmarks. The result had been remarkable, not just in terms of productivity, but in terms of morale. Workers took ownership of the project in a way Micah had never seen before, catching potential problems early and suggesting improvements that saved both time and money. "Any word from the City Planning Committee on the green space modifications?" Micah asked. "Approved yesterday," Elena grinned. "They said it was the most comprehensive environmental impact plan they'd seen in years." Mrs. Patterson from the Environmental Review Board actually used the word visionary. Visionary. A year ago, Micah would have laughed at the idea that anyone would use that word to describe him. But under Jade's mentorship, he'd learned to think beyond just completing projects, to consider their long-term impact on communities, environment, and the people who would eventually call these buildings home. His phone buzzed with a text from Jade. "Investor meeting at 10. Bring the Phase 2 presentations. They're excited to hear your expansion ideas." Phase 2. When the project had started, everyone assumed Phase 1 would be the end of Micah's involvement, a successful debut that would lead to him handling smaller projects under closer supervision. But the Riverside development had exceeded every projection, attracting national attention and a waiting list of potential buyers that stretched into the hundreds. Now, the investors weren't just asking for Phase 2. They were asking Micah to design an entire neighborhood based on his integrated community model. As he drove to the Thompson and Associates offices, Micah reflected on how much his life had changed. He'd moved from his cramped studio apartment to a spacious two-bedroom condo. He'd bought his mother a new car and paid off her medical bills. He'd started investing in his own retirement account instead of living paycheck to paycheck. But the material changes paled beside the personal transformation. For the first time in his adult life, he woke up each morning excited about his work. He had ideas, not just tasks to complete, but visions for how things could be better. And people listened to those ideas, built on them, and trusted him to make them reality. The Thompson and Associates conference room looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago, but Micah's relationship to the space had changed completely. Instead of standing nervously by the projector, he now sat at the table as an equal participant in the discussion. "The Phase 1 pre-sales have exceeded projections by 40%, Marcus Williams was saying to the assembled investors. "We've got a waiting list for units that won't be completed until next year." James Morrison leaned forward with interest. "What's driving the demand?" "The market's been soft for luxury developments lately." "That's exactly the point," Micah said, opening his presentation on the large screen. "We didn't build a luxury development. We built a community." The slide showed an aerial view of the construction site, with color-coded sections indicating different housing types, luxury condos, market-rate apartments, and affordable family units, all integrated within the same development. "Traditional developments segregate income levels," Micah continued, his confidence evident in his clear, engaging presentation style. "Rich people live here, middle-class people live there, working families live somewhere else entirely. It creates isolation and limits economic mobility." He clicked to the next slide, showing demographic data and buyer profiles. At Riverside, a young teacher can afford a one-bedroom apartment in the same building where a senior executive owns a penthouse. Their children go to the same community center, shop at the same stores, benefit from the same infrastructure investments. Sarah Chen nodded approvingly. The marketing response has been incredible. People are excited about the community aspect, not just the individual units. Plus, added Marcus, the mixed income model provides financial stability. Even if the luxury market softens, we've got steady income from the market rate and affordable units. One of the newer investors, David Kim from Pacific Coast Development, looked skeptical. This all sounds very idealistic, but what about property values? Won't the affordable units drag down the overall market value? It was the same concern that had been raised repeatedly throughout the development process, and Micah had comprehensive data to address it. Actually, the opposite has happened, he said, clicking to a detailed market analysis. The integrated community model has created what urban planners call positive externalities. The whole becomes more valuable than the sum of its parts. He highlighted key statistics on the screen. Property values in integrated developments appreciate faster than segregated ones because they create more vibrant, sustainable communities. People want to live in places that feel alive and diverse, not in sterile enclaves. David Kim studied the data with growing interest. These numbers are impressive, but are they sustainable? What happens when other developers start copying the model? Jade, who had been listening quietly from her position at the head of the table, finally spoke up. Mr. Kim, you're asking the right questions, but I think you're missing the bigger picture. This isn't just about one successful project. It's about proving that profitable development and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. She stood and walked to the presentation screen, her presence commanding immediate attention. For too long, our industry has operated on the assumption that maximizing profit requires minimizing humanity. Treat workers as expendable, segregate communities by income, build for short-term gain rather than long-term sustainability. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the passion that had built her company from nothing. What Micah has demonstrated is that the opposite is true. When you invest in people, your workers, your buyers, your community, you create value that goes far beyond quarterly returns. She gestured toward the construction photos on the screen. Every worker on this project knows their name is going on the completion plaque. Every buyer knows they're investing in a community, not just a unit. Every neighbor knows this development will make their area more valuable, not less. James Morrison was taking notes, clearly impressed. What kind of timeline are we looking at for Phase 2? Micah felt his heart rate quicken. This was the moment he'd been building toward, the chance to expand his vision into something even more ambitious. Phase 2 would be a 5-building expansion, adding 200 units across all income levels, he said, his voice steady despite his excitement. But I'd like to propose something more comprehensive than just additional housing. He clicked to a new slide showing architectural renderings of a complete neighborhood transformation. Integrated retail space on the ground floors, providing local businesses with affordable commercial rent. A community health clinic. A small business incubator. Childcare facilities. The goal isn't just to house people. It's to create a complete ecosystem for economic mobility. The room fell silent as the investors absorbed the scope of his vision. This wasn't just a real estate development. It was urban planning on a scale that could serve as a model for cities across the country. The investment would be significant, Micah continued, but so would the returns. We're not just selling apartments. We're selling a way of life that people are desperate for in an increasingly divided society. David Kim leaned back in his chair, clearly reconsidering his initial skepticism. How confident are you that this model is scalable? Confident enough to stake my career on it, Micah replied without hesitation. And confident enough that I'd like to propose forming a separate development company specifically focused on integrated community projects. The words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Jade's eyes widened slightly. This was the first she'd heard of Micah's entrepreneurial ambitions. You want to start your own company? Marcus asked. Not exactly, Micah said, his heart pounding but his voice clear. I want to partner with Thompson and Associates to create a subsidiary focused specifically on this type of development. I'd handle the vision and execution while leveraging the resources and reputation of an established firm. He looked directly at Jade, hoping his proposal wouldn't be seen as betrayal or ingratitude. I've learned everything I know about leadership from watching you, Ms. Thompson. Now I'd like to build something that honors those lessons while expanding the impact we can have. For a long moment, Jade said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, Slowly, a smile spread across her face. Not just approval, but genuine pride. "Micah," she said, "6 months ago, you were afraid to speak up in meetings. Now you're proposing to revolutionize urban development. I think that might be the best return on investment I've ever seen." She turned to address the other investors. "Gentlemen and ladies, I'd like to propose that we approve not just Phase 2 of the Riverside project, but the formation of Thompson-Patterson Integrated Communities, with Micah as managing partner and Thompson and Associates as the primary investor." The room erupted in discussion as investors began calculating numbers and asking detailed questions. But Micah found himself focused on a single word: Patterson. Jade had used his last name in the company name, treating him as an equal partner rather than a subsidiary. As the meeting continued around him, Micah felt a profound sense of completion. He'd gone from invisible assistant to equal partner in less than a year, but more importantly, he'd discovered that success wasn't just about personal advancement. It was about creating opportunities for others to advance as well. Outside the conference room windows, the city sprawled in all directions, full of communities that could be transformed, workers who could be empowered, families who could be housed with dignity. And for the first time in his life, Micah Patterson felt like he had the tools, the resources, and the vision to make that transformation happen. But he wasn't the only one whose life had been changed by the events of that day 6 months ago. Across town, Brent Kingsley was learning his own painful lessons about the consequences of treating people as disposable. The Grandview Hotel ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the quiet murmur of the city's real estate elite. The annual Metropolitan Development Awards Gala was the industry's most prestigious event, where deals were celebrated, connections were made, and reputations were either built or destroyed. Jade Thompson stood near the bar, elegant in a midnight blue gown that complemented her natural confidence. She held a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, her attention focused on the presentation stage where award winners were being announced. And the award for Most Innovative Community Development goes to... The presenter paused for dramatic effect. The Riverside Integrated Community Project, led by Thompson-Patterson Integrated Communities. The ballroom erupted in applause as Micah walked to the stage, looking comfortable in his tailored tuxedo, a far cry from the nervous assistant who had once carried presentation folders. As he accepted the Crystal Award, his eyes found Jade in the crowd, and he mouthed, "Thank you," with a smile that radiated genuine gratitude and pride. "This award belongs to everyone who believed that profitable development and social responsibility could coexist," Micah said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "To the construction workers who took ownership of quality, to the buyers who invested in community, and to the mentor who taught me that true leadership means lifting others as you rise." The applause continued as he left the stage, and Jade felt a warmth that had nothing to do with recognition or business success. Watching Micah transform from invisible assistant to industry leader had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her career. "Quite a speech," said a familiar voice behind her. Jade turned to see James Morrison approaching, his expression thoughtful. "He's come a long way in a year." "He was always capable," Jade replied. "He just needed someone to see it." "And what about you?" Morrison asked. "Any regrets about giving him so much autonomy? Some people might have kept tighter control over such a promising protege." Jade's smile was enigmatic. "Jim, the best leaders don't create followers. They create more leaders. Micah's success doesn't diminish mine, it multiplies it." Across the ballroom, near the registration table, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Brent Kingsley stood awkwardly in a rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit, holding a drink he desperately wished was stronger than wine. The past year had not been kind to him. After losing the Thompson contract and Micah's departure, Kingsley Development had spiraled quickly. Without Micah's detailed work and client relationships, 3 major projects had fallen through due to timeline failures and budget overruns. 2 other employees had left for competitors, taking their institutional knowledge with them. The final blow had come 6 months ago when the Riverside investors, frustrated with delays and cost overruns under Brent's management, had terminated their contract and awarded the project to Thompson-Patterson Integrated Communities instead. The financial and reputational damage had been devastating. "Brent," a hesitant voice interrupted his brooding. He turned to see Carol Martinez, a former colleague from his early days in real estate. I thought that was you. How have you been? The question was loaded with the kind of careful concern people used when they'd heard bad news, but weren't sure how much to acknowledge. Fine, Brent lied smoothly. Just evaluating some new opportunities. Carol nodded politely, but her eyes held the look of someone who knew exactly what evaluating opportunities meant in their industry. It meant his company was in trouble, and he was here networking desperately, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. I saw the announcement about the Riverside project, she said, clearly trying to be diplomatic. That must have been disappointing. Disappointing. That was one word for watching a project he'd originated become a national model for innovative development under someone else's leadership. Watching his former assistant win awards for implementing ideas that had originally been developed under his company's roof. These things happen, Brent said, finishing his wine in a single gulp. The important thing is to learn from setbacks and move forward. But even as he said the words, he knew they rang hollow. The truth was, he hadn't learned from his setbacks. He'd simply become bitter about them. Every success story he read about Micah or Thompson and Associates felt like a personal attack, a reminder of opportunities he'd squandered through his own arrogance. The crowd began moving toward the main dining area as dinner was announced. Brent found himself walking alone, a sharp contrast to previous years when he'd been surrounded by colleagues and clients eager for his attention. He was so focused on projecting an image of confidence, he didn't feel that he almost walked directly into a small group near the entrance to the dining room. As he looked up to apologize, his blood froze. It was Jade Thompson, surrounded by several other industry leaders, all congratulating her on the success of the integrated community model. She looked radiant, confident, successful, everything he'd once thought he was, but had never actually been. For a moment, their eyes met across the small crowd. Jade's expression was unreadable, neither hostile nor particularly welcoming. Just aware. "Excuse me," Brent muttered to the group, intending to walk around them and avoid any potential confrontation. "Mr. Kingsley," Jade's voice stopped him mid-step. The conversations around them gradually quieted as people sensed the tension. He turned back, his face already flushed with the anticipation of public humiliation. "Ms. Thompson, I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the people nearby. The words were so unexpected that Brent almost couldn't process them. "Thank me for providing such a clear example of what not to do," Jade continued, her tone perfectly professional but with an edge that cut like a blade. "Your treatment of Micah became a case study in my leadership seminars. It's amazing how instructive poor management can be." The small crowd around them had gone completely silent, sensing drama but not sure whether to stay or leave. Brent felt his face burning with shame and rage. That wasn't." He started, then stopped. What could he say? That he hadn't meant to be dismissive? That he'd always planned to give Micah more recognition? Everyone in the industry knew the truth now. "You know what the most tragic part is?" Jade continued, her voice softening slightly. "Micah's talent was right there in front of you for 3 years. All you had to do was see it, acknowledge it, nurture it. Instead, you treated him like he was invisible." She paused, letting that sink in. "In doing so, you made yourself irrelevant. Because the moment someone else recognized his value, he had no reason to stay with someone who didn't." The words hit Brent like physical blows. Every person listening, and there were more now, as word of the confrontation spread through the crowd, could see the truth in them. This wasn't just about one failed business relationship. It was about a fundamental approach to leadership that had finally caught up with him. "I hope," Jade said, her voice returning to its professional tone, "that other managers in our industry can learn from your example. That they'll understand that success comes from building people up, not tearing them down." With that, she turned and walked into the dining room, leaving Brent standing alone as conversations gradually resumed around him. The damage was complete, not just to his business prospects, but to his reputation and self-image. As the crowd dispersed, Brent found himself walking toward the hotel's exit rather than the dining room. He couldn't face an evening of networking and small talk, knowing that everyone would be discussing his public humiliation. But as he reached the lobby, he heard his name called again. This time, it was Micah. "Mr. Kingsley?" Micah approached cautiously, still carrying his award. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Brent's first instinct was to refuse, to escape this final humiliation as quickly as possible. But something in Micah's tone, not triumph or malice, but something approaching concern, made him stop. "What do you want, Micah?" he asked wearily. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry about how things worked out," Micah said quietly. "I know this has been a difficult year for you." The words were so unexpected, so gracious, that Brent felt tears threatening. Here was the young man whose career he'd tried to sabotage, whose contributions he'd stolen for years, offering sympathy for his downfall. "Why?" Brent asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you be sorry? I treated you terribly. You owe me nothing." Micah was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Because I learned something important this year," he finally said. "Success isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about building something meaningful. And I couldn't have built what I've built without learning from your mistakes, as well as Jade's wisdom." He paused, then continued with the kind of maturity that Brent was only beginning to recognize. "You gave me 3 years of experience, even if you didn't give me 3 years of recognition. That experience was valuable, even when the environment wasn't healthy." Brent looked at this young man, no longer his assistant, but a successful business owner in his own right, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine respect for someone else's character. "I should have seen your potential," Brent said quietly. "I should have treated you better." "Yes," Micah agreed simply. "You should have. But that's in the past now. The question is what you do with the lessons you've learned." If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.